Earlier this morning, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein testified on the proposed budget for the Justice Department before a Senate subcommittee. Here's part of his testimony.
Committee will come to order. Mr. Deputy Attorney General, welcome to the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Subcommittee, which we will be hearing and examining the Department of Justice fiscal year 2018 budget requests. I'm pleased to welcome you here to your first hearing before this subcommittee, and I'm grateful that you and Attorney General Sessions have brought new, desperately needed leadership to the DOJ. Your input is helpful and necessary as we review the President's spending priorities for the Justice Department in order to ensure that the country's national security and law enforcement needs are funded appropriately and sufficiently. This is a challenging budget climate, as you know. As violent crime has risen and terrorists have escalated, fiscal constraints have tightened. The President proposes to decrease funding at the Department of Justice by $637 million in 2018 for a new total of $28.3 billion. Since the start of the new administration and during the early days of your tenure as the Deputy Attorney General, I'm pleased that the Department is refocusing on its core mission of enforcing our nation's Constitution and duly enacted laws. I believe it's critical that we target our finite law enforcement resources toward the worst criminals in our society. And I agree with the Attorney General's directive to federal prosecutors to go after the most violent offenders that we have in our country. Additionally, the importance of prosecuting violent crime is reflected in the President's budget request for 230 new assistant U.S. attorneys to help address this growing problem. This reordering of priorities was further underscored by the Attorney General's reversal of the Obama administration's lenient charging and sentencing policies, requiring federal prosecutors now to pursue the most serious charges and sentences possible. The stronger federal law enforcement approach towards drug crimes, I believe, is critical, and this is a key area where we hope, and I hope you will, see results for more stringent prosecution and sentencing. The heroin and other drug crisis that we have is fueled by drug traffickers who must be brought to justice, I believe, under the law. The Department is also refocused on the critical problem of illegal immigration, making it a priority for prosecutors and in empowering them to bring felony charges whenever possible under the law. Illegal immigration has become one of the most critical problems facing our nation, so it's encouraging to learn that President Trump's tough approach is already resulting in reduced illegal border crossings. To back up the newfound emphasis on tackling illegal immigration, the budget request seeks 40 deputy U.S. Marshals to address the criminal alien problem, 70 additional border enforcement prosecutors, 20 attorneys and support staff to handle civil condemnation work for the southwest border wall, and 20 attorneys and support staff for immigration litigation assistance. I also appreciate the Department's related efforts to place immigration judges in jurisdiction where they are most needed and to quickly hire the immigration judges which the subcommittee has previously funded. Over the last 8 years, dozens of these benches have gone unfulfilled due to the former administration's failure to act. In the meantime, the backlog of immigration cases has grown to a staggering number of 600,000. The proposed budget seeks to increase of $65 million for the Executive Office for Immigration Review to hire another 65 immigration judge teams on top of the 10 that were just provided in the 17 omnibus. We will closely review the details of this request to balance the tremendous need with the restrictive budget environment that we're facing. I trust that the recent establishment of the Department's Task Force on Crime Reduction and Public Safety will continue to provide new ideas and recommendations on how our nation can best combat violent crime, illegal immigration, and other law enforcement challenges. Cybersecurity and counterterrorism remain two of my top national security concerns, and we would want to know more about how this budget supports the Department's efforts to these critical fields. I thank you for your testimony today, and we look forward to hearing you in the question period. You may your entire written statement, Mr. Deputy, will be Attorney General, will be made part of the hearing record in its entirety. You proceed. Well, wait a minute. I'm moving too fast. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate having the opportunity to make a statement this morning and appreciate your being here, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein. The Appropriations Committee not only holds the purse strings for the federal government, as you're aware, but it also has a key role in performing oversight activities for all agencies under its jurisdiction, in this case for the Department of Justice. I am troubled, I have to say, because for this subcommittee it's incredibly unusual to hold a hearing with the Deputy Attorney General when there is a sitting Attorney General. This is the second time Attorney General Sessions has declined to appear before this subcommittee, canceling just days before he is scheduled to appear in an open public setting. As the nation's chief law enforcement officer, the Attorney General is the most appropriate person to come before this subcommittee and testify as to the important work of the Department of Justice. DOJ is on the front lines fighting the deadly, uncontrolled opioid epidemic, and it is still gaining strength. The DOJ hiring freeze risks the safety of correctional officers in our federal prisons, and curiously, the request for the Federal Bureau of Investigation is less than Congress provided for fiscal year 2017, even while the Bureau conducts the crucial counterintelligence investigation into Russian influence in our 2016 election process. While providing testimony before a newly scheduled Senate Intelligence Committee hearing is important, and I understand that, the Attorney General is still responsible for answering critical questions from this committee. He needs to provide his explanation of DOJ's budget as well as a defense of his policies in an open public hearing for not only us, but for the American public. Mr. Rosenstein, I applaud your appointment of Robert Mueller as the special counsel to oversee the ongoing investigation into Russian interference during the 2016 election and believe this will help to depoliticize that investigation. However, many questions remain about both your and Attorney General Sessions' role in this matter, your knowledge of resource requests made by former Director Comey, your involvement in Comey's firing, and your prior meetings with Russian officials, among many concerns. I will return to these subjects during my question period later and know that many of my colleagues will express their concern and questions as well. So, Deputy Attorney General, I look forward to your testimony, to our discussion today, and to, at some future date, having the Attorney General appear before us in open session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Leahy, you have an opening statement.
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and Ranking Member Shaheen. The Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, I won't mince words. You're not the witness we were supposed to hear from today. You're not the witness who should be behind that table. That responsibility lies with the Attorney General of the United States. Attorneys General of the past did not shy away from this committee's questions, regardless of the topic, regardless of the party. Attorneys General of the past did not cower at the request of Congress to fulfill its constitutional oversight responsibility. And they didn't agree to come and then cancel at the last minute and then send their second in command instead, because the members of this committee may have questions they may not want to answer. Until now, that is. And so with respect, Mr. Rosenstein, and I voted for you, as you know, you're not who I'm interested in speaking with or hearing from today. I do have questions for the Attorney General. I want to know why he has provided false testimony to me and to Senator Franken. I want to know why, if he is recused from the Russian investigation, he played any role in the dismissal of FBI Director Comey. I want to know how he believes he can credibly lead the Justice Department, for which he has requested $28.3 billion, amid such distressing questions about his actions and his integrity. Importantly, I believe the Attorney General of the United States, the nation's chief law enforcement officer, owes it to the more than 116,000 Justice Department agents, intelligence analysts, attorneys, and support personnel, the roughly 1 million state, local, and tribal police officers, and staff supporting more than 4,500 local victim assistance programs in every state to justify the budget request of the Department of Justice. He owes them that courtesy because the President's budget request for the Justice Department is abysmal. It cuts the department's budget by $643 million from the FY 2017 enacted level. The department's request is built on unrealistic assumptions. But worse than that, it's also built on the backs of crime victims, with a permanent rescission of $1.3 billion from the Crime Victims Fund. Let me repeat that. The President and the administration have talked about how they support the victims of crime, but they're asking for a $1.3 billion rescission from the Crime Victims Fund. I don't know how you try to combine the rhetoric with the reality, how you can say you're for the victims of crime, but, oh, by the way, we're going to close the door on you. And ironically, in a budget touted as tough on crime, the President cuts funding for FBI operations and investigations by $44 million. We know we have to move ahead with the new FBI headquarters. There's no funds for that. I have my own suspicions about why the President may seek cuts to FBI operations and personnel, but I want the Attorney General to come here and talk about it. Just this week, the Attorney General crowed about how he has law enforcement's back, but the Justice Department's budget slashes $326 million in assistance to state and local law enforcement assistance grants, states, every one of which is represented on both sides of this dais. The budget slashes funding for anti-opioid and heroin initiatives by more than $27 million. It includes eliminating $10 million from the COPS Anti-Heroin Task Force, which state and local law enforcement teams in areas worse hit by the opioid epidemic used for investigation going after street traffickers. You know, everybody calls the opioid situation a public health crisis. I don't know how the Justice Department justifies cutting resources will help our communities with prevention, education, and treatment. I'm not surprised that while they cut out the money for opioids, they propose millions of dollars to hire lawyers to focus on seizing private land from hardworking Americans along the southwest border so the president can build his misguided wall. We won't protect our people, but by golly, we'll seize their land. The unbalanced and misplaced priorities of this budget makes one thing clear. Rather than a foundation for American greatness, President Trump and Attorney General Sessions are intent on making our communities less safe, abandoning victims of crime, and victimizing and villainizing immigrants who contribute to our communities. And finally, Mr. Rosenstein, regardless of the circumstance of your appearance today, I'll raise this one point with you. On May 1, the Office of Legal Counsel issued an opinion arguing that the executive branch is not obligated to meet the legitimate oversight requests of individual members of Congress. It opined the only requests from the chairs of committees must be met. This is an affront to the Congress, a co-equal branch of government. I've been here with the Republican and Democratic administrations. I've been here a number of times when Republicans controlled the Senate, a number of times when Democrats did. I've never, ever heard anybody, Republican or Democrat, make this claim. In fact, we've roundly rejected it on both sides of the aisle. Judiciary Committee Chairman Grassley, with whom I've worked both when I was chair and then when I was ranking member, called your opinion nonsense. Now, the Attorney General has the authority. I actually believe he has an obligation to withdraw that opinion. The administration may seek to hide many things from the American people, but they should know this. Today's committee chairs are tomorrow's ranking members. Obstructing congressional oversight will do nothing to advance the interests of the American people. This should be withdrawn. Mr. Chairman, I'll put my whole statement
Thank
on the
you.
record.
Without objection. Mr. Rosenstein, you may proceed.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Chairman Shelby, Ranking Member Shaheen, members of the committee. I am honored to present the President's fiscal year 2018 budget for the Department of Justice. Our proposed budget advances the interests of the American people by allowing the dedicated men and women of the Department of Justice to continue their outstanding work. We're grateful for your strong support, and we look forward to building on our successes as we work to protect the nation, to promote the rule of law, and to ensure equal justice for all. Our 2018 budget request shows a strong commitment to the Justice Department's top priorities. It provides more funding to fight terrorism and cybercrime, to reduce violent crime, to tackle the opioid epidemic, and to combat illegal immigration. It also gives us the resources we need to support our state, local, and tribal partners in their essential law enforcement work. This budget reflects three important themes. Number one, truth in budgeting. Number two, increases in efficiency. And number three, focusing on priorities. These changes are critical, and they support the executive order of the President to reorganize government agencies for the goal of increasing efficiency and effectiveness. First, the budget is an honest one, eliminating from the books thousands of previously unfunded and vacant positions that give a misleading impression of the personnel we have on duty in the department. Those ghost positions, in most cases, have been vacant for years or have never been filled at all. Secondly, this budget seeks to identify areas where we can afford to cut back without harming our mission. And finally, the budget improves the allocation of our precious resources so that we can do the most effective work with every taxpayer dollar that we spend. National security remains our highest priority. We face a wide array of evolving threats, from terrorism to espionage and cybercrime. We also need to come to terms, Senators, with the growing dark challenge, which I know you're all familiar with. Going dark refers to law enforcement's increasing inability to lawfully access, collect, and intercept real-time communications and stored data, even with a warrant, as a result of changes in technologies. This phenomenon severely impairs our ability to conduct investigations and bring criminals to justice. Our law enforcement officers operate within the Constitution, and they respect legitimate privacy interests. But when there is a legitimate law enforcement need to access electronic information, and when we have a court order or other legal authority, public safety is jeopardized when we're unable to obtain that relevant information. Our department must keep adapting to evolving challenges. To that end, the budget provides an extra $98.5 million to combat terrorism, espionage, and cybersecurity threats. The Justice Department also is committed to protecting the American people from violent crime and from the adverse effects of illegal drug distribution, both of which are spiking at alarming rates. Violent crime is rising in many areas of our nation, and drug-related injuries and deaths are increasing across the country. Senators, the evidence of this is indisputable. Rising violent crime and increasing drug abuse are devastating many American families. And the Justice Department is confronting these crises head-on, and we need your help. The proposed budget provides the department's law enforcement agencies with extra support so they can target the worst violent criminals, transnational crime organizations, gangs, and drug trafficking rings. It also provides, as the chairman mentioned, for 230 additional assistant U.S. attorneys to focus specifically on our efforts to fight violent crime. Those additional resources will enhance the ability of federal law enforcement to fight crime and to keep our communities safe. We are focusing also on getting illicit drugs off of the streets through strong enforcement efforts and through our drug take-back programs. In addition to that, we call on doctors, pharmacists, and pharmaceutical companies to take a hard look at their practices and help us develop ways that we can reduce the harmful overprescription of pharmaceutical drugs. The American people also expect our government to secure our borders and to restore a lawful system of immigration. The Department of Justice will do our part in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security. Our proposed budget provides much-needed funding to hire 75 additional immigration judges and support personnel to reduce the unacceptable backlog in our immigration courts. It will also allow us to hire more deputy U.S. Marshals and 30 more border enforcement prosecutors so that we can effectively apprehend and prosecute criminal aliens who threaten our communities. The federal government, of course, does not maintain public safety alone. 85% of the law enforcement officers in our country are not federal. They work for our state, local, and tribal partners, and we rely on them heavily. The men and women serving on the front lines are our first line of defense, and they help to keep our communities safe. But they deserve our support. Our budget maintains our commitments to these valued partners, and it prioritizes grant funding to the high-performing programs that have proven to be effective. This budget funds important priorities while helping us to achieve a more efficient and cost-effective department. We will do all we can to be good stewards of the department's resources. We have a duty to avoid waste and to safeguard taxpayer money so it will be available to fight crime and protect people. The Department of Justice is home to 115,000 honorable men and women who work every day to serve, protect, and defend the American people and respect the Constitution of the United States. This budget makes it possible for us to do our jobs. With the investments set forth in the budget and with your support, we will continue to fairly enforce our nation's laws and ensure safety and equal justice for all Americans. So I look forward to working with this subcommittee and with the Congress in the months and years ahead. And if I may, Senators, my few remaining moments, I learned this morning about an incident in Georgia in which we understand that 2 correctional officers were murdered in the course of transporting prisoners in Georgia. I talked with the Marshal Service Director, David Harlow, this morning, and we have committed all federal resources to help catch those fugitives and hold the perpetrators accountable. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families and in support of the law enforcement personnel who are working on that case as we sit here today. An attack on any American law enforcement officer is an attack on every American law enforcement officer and on the principles that we all believe in. The Senators, I will be happy to take any questions about our proposed budget. and I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. I'll try to stay within the budget area that I'm interested in this morning. Mr. Rosenstein, what specifically is the Department of Justice doing to accelerate the hiring of new immigration judges?
Well, thank you, Senator. This has been one of my top priorities. As you know, I've been in the job for 6 weeks, and I learned when I took the position about this.
Take the mic up to you a little bit.
I learned very early in my tenure about this extraordinary backlog in immigration cases, and that has been one of my top priorities to address that. Our fiscal year 2018 budget includes $145 million to enhance border security and immigration enforcement, and that includes, as I mentioned in my opening statement, 75 new immigration judge teams, and I believe it's approximately 450 people, the judges and their support staff, and $75 million to address that backlog, which exceeds 500,000 and is approaching, as the chairman mentioned, 600,000. It also includes additional assistant U.S. attorneys and $7 million to prosecute violations of our immigration laws, additional deputy U.S. marshals, and additional attorneys in the civil division. But with regard specifically to your question about the backlog, Senator, we are very focused on that. One of the challenges that we had was some bureaucratic delays in hiring and filling vacancies. So in addition to creating 75 new judges and filling those positions and their support personnel, we're also expediting the hiring of immigration judges to fill the existing vacancies. So it's a big challenge. I've talked with the leadership of that office, and we're going to make it a top priority to first put an end to the increase in the backlog, and then to work on ways that we can more efficiently and more quickly reduce that backlog, because my view, Senator, is that everybody who has a case pending in our immigration court deserves an expeditious resolution of that case.
Can you move, and are you moving some judges around to where they're most in need? Because
yes, we are,
Senator. Got to be a surge somewhere.
Yes, in fact, we have moved some immigration judges to the border districts, I believe, and we're going to continue looking at that. Obviously, we have the 75 who are proposed in this budget. We have, I believe, approximately 56 vacancies that already exist, and we're certainly going to put those judges where we think that they are most needed and where we think they can do the most good.
Getting into counterterrorism, you know, that's a top priority for this subcommittee, and I believe it is for the Justice Department, too. And, of course, the FBI's Terrorist Explosive Device Analytical Center, we call TDAC, is very critical, given that IEDs are still prevalent and dangerous tools, as you know, used by terrorists at home and abroad, and could and probably will visit us in a big way in this country. The forensics investigations conducted by TDAC personnel have led to the convictions of the shoe bomber, the Boston Marathon bomber, and other terrorists. So you probably can understand some of us' disappointment with the department's budget request that includes a $76 million reduction proposal for the FBI's construction account, which includes facilities for TDAC. That's hard for us to swallow.
Yes, Senator. Well, my understanding of that, as you mentioned, the TDAC was formally designated to serve as our single strategic center to investigate IEDs, explosive devices, in January 2015. And I think it has been extraordinarily valuable, as you mentioned, in investigations and in training for the government. My understanding, Senator, is that with regard to that $76 million, and this is based upon our career experts, some of whom are sitting behind us, is this was a one-time, non-recurring request, and we simply didn't have the need for additional construction funds this year. It does not reflect any lack of support for the operations of the TDAC. We believe it's a very efficient and effective operation, and we intend to continue supporting it. We simply don't need that additional construction funding this year.
Yeah, we're going to have to work on that. We'll try to work with you. Sanctuary cities. This is an ongoing problem in our country, and you know this very well. My question, grants awards to state and local jurisdictions are tied to compliance with federal laws, as I understand. And the Bureau of Prisons must give immigration and customs enforcement officials priority regarding federal detainers. Is that correct? You want me to state that again?
I'm sorry, the priority?
I understand that grant awards to state and local jurisdictions are tied to compliance with all federal laws.
Yes, that is correct.
That's correct. And the Bureau of Prisons must give, or should give, immigration and customs enforcement officials priority regarding federal detainers.
I don't believe we have any issue with cooperation from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. That's correct, Senator.
This is a problem, though, in the country, is it not?
It's a challenge with regard to some state and local facilities that do not honor our immigration detainers.
I've got a few other questions for the record, but there are a lot of people wanting to question you. Senator Sheehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rosenstein, many news outlets last night and this morning are reporting that President Trump is considering firing Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Under the regulations governing the appointment of a special counsel, 28 CFR 600, and I quote, "The special counsel may be disciplined or removed from office only by the personal action of the Attorney General. The Attorney General may remove a special counsel for misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, or for other good cause, including violation of departmental policies. The Attorney General shall inform the special counsel in writing of the specific reason for his or her removal." Now, as I understand, Mr. Rosenstein, in this matter, you are actually the one exercising hiring and firing authority because Attorney General Sessions is recused. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And at this point, have you seen any evidence of good cause for firing of Special Counsel Mueller?
No, I have not.
And have you given the special counsel full independence from the Justice Department to conduct his investigation?
Yes, Senator, and I appreciate that question. At the last hearing I attended, I explained it would require a long time to explain exactly why. I'm confident that he has full independence. The short answer is, though, that regulation, as you may know, was written and implemented during the Clinton administration under the authority of Attorney General Reno. I know the folks who wrote that. They wrote it to deal with these sort of situations, and I am confident that he will have sufficient independence. And it's certainly theoretically possible that the Attorney General could fire him, but that's the only person who has authority to fire him. And in fact, the chain of command for the special counsel is only directly to the Attorney General, or in this case, the acting Attorney General. So nobody else in the department would have authority to do that. And you have my assurance that we're going to faithfully follow that regulation, and Director Mueller is going to have a full degree of independence that he needs to conduct that investigation appropriately.
And is there a record that gives him that full independence? Is that done in a letter or an order from you as the Deputy Attorney General?
Yes, Senator. It's done in the order, which I believe was issued on May 17th. And the order references the regulation from which you've read, and so that is the source of his authority.
Thank you. You mentioned in your opening comments about the importance of the budget request for 230 assistant U.S. attorneys. I certainly agree that that's important. I am concerned, however, that we still we had an en masse firing of U.S. attorneys in the country, and as far as I know, at least in New Hampshire, we haven't made any nominations to replace the person who was fired. Can you tell me how many U.S. attorneys have been nominated throughout the country?
I believe, Senator, that the President announced his first set of nominations yesterday, and I believe there were 7 or 8 in that first round. And what I can assure you is that we are moving very expeditiously, and I think that there's been some press that I think may be somewhat misleading about that. I believe we're actually going to be ahead of most recent administrations in the speed by which we're appointing U.S. attorneys. It's obviously very important to me because I spent 12 years serving as a U.S. attorney, and I know how important good U.S. attorneys are to the operations of the Department of Justice. In fact, the last 2 Saturdays I've spent in the department interviewing candidates for about 10 districts each weekend, and so we anticipate that by the end of the summer, we'll see a large number of U.S. attorneys nominated throughout the country.
Well, I certainly am glad to hear that. It's my understanding, at least in New Hampshire, we haven't seen wholesale firing of U.S. attorneys in the way that we did in this administration. Was there a reason why every U.S. attorney in the country was fired on the same day?
So, Senator, I'm pleased to tell you not everyone was fired because I was one of the U.S. attorneys that day.
Good.
There were four who were not fired. But I was not in the department at that time. I learned about the firings after the decision had been made, so I have no insight into why that decision was made.
You mentioned in your opening statement the tragedy in Georgia and the officers who were killed, murdered. It's a reminder that those who work in our prisons do have a very difficult job that is very dangerous. And I am troubled by the fact that while the administration's hiring freeze was lifted in April, that the Department of Justice has been under a self-imposed hiring freeze since mid-February. And while there was a blanket exemption for positions relating to public safety and national security, it doesn't include the Bureau of Prisons, which is still under a freeze. And in fact, in New Hampshire, FCI Berlin had extended conditional offers to 7 potential employees, 5 of whom were correctional officers, but due to the imposition of the hiring freeze, those positions were canceled by DOJ, so they were not able to go forward with that hiring. As you point out, this is a difficult job. Can you explain why we continue to have a hiring freeze on correctional officers within the Bureau of Prisons?
Well, Senator, I appreciate that question. I think there may be some misunderstanding about this. The department froze BOP hiring at the headquarters in Washington and at the regional administrative offices, but my understanding is that the department allowed BOP institutions to continue hiring up to their staffing levels as of January 22nd, which means that if people left, they would be able to fill those vacancies. So within that overall level of staffing, I believe we've left the discretion with BOP to hire for whichever positions it believes are most critical to its operations. Now, obviously, there has been a continuing decline in the number of federal prisoners and commensurately probably less of a need for personnel. But I'm going to go back and talk with Director Kane about that and make sure that we do have proper staffing for that prison. As far as I know, he does have discretion to fill those positions if he thinks it's appropriate.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to do that. I would urge you to follow through because it's my understanding that because the positions were not officially filled by the time of the February guidance, that they were canceled by DOJ.
I will look into that.
Thank you.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Attorney General Mr. Rosenstein, I just want to follow up quickly on the 2 questions that Senator Shaheen asked you about the special counsel. Has the president ever discussed with you the appointment of the special counsel or discussed the special counsel in any way?
No, he has not.
And second, if President Trump ordered you to fire the special counsel, what would you do?
Well, Senator, I'm not going to follow any orders unless I believe those are lawful and appropriate orders. Under the regulation, Special Counsel Mueller may be fired only for good cause, and I am required to put that cause in writing. And so that's what I would do. If there were a good cause, I would consider it. If there were not good cause, it wouldn't matter to me what anybody says.
Thank you. I want to turn to the opioid crisis, which plagues my state and so many others. Last year, drug overdoses were responsible for more than 59,000 deaths in this country, including a record 376 such deaths in Maine. That is 104 more overdose deaths than the year before in my state. So we're not making progress. The situation is actually getting worse despite considerable efforts on the part of so many. Last year, I was briefed in Maine by federal law enforcement officers who told me that they had seen a major influx of drug dealers coming from out of state with direct ties to gangs in major cities, as well as the Mexican drug cartels. For example, in one case, gang members trafficked heroin between New Haven, Connecticut, and Bangor, Maine, where I live. They traded drugs for firearms and then distributed those firearms to other gang members upon their return to Connecticut. We obviously need a multi-pronged approach to the heroin and opioid crisis that includes treatment, education and prevention, and law enforcement. And key to that law enforcement leg of the stool is cooperation among federal, state, and local officials. The department's budget requests $3 million less than Congress appropriated for the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act programs for the current fiscal year. And even more troubling to me, there is no funding proposed for the COPS Anti-Heroin Task Force. In my state, this program has helped law enforcement officers seize heroin and prescription opioids and arrest drug dealers. Why is the administration proposing this cut in the CARA funding and eliminating the funding for the COPS Anti-Heroin Task Force?
Senator, I appreciate that question. I think there are a lot of important issues. For me, this is actually one of the most important issues that I hope to talk about today. I don't know if I can give a complete answer in a minute and 35 seconds, but let me tell you, I've actually brought with me a chart that I think would be of interest to you. This is a chart of drug overdose deaths in the United States of America. This issue first came to my attention as U.S. Attorney in Maryland about 3 or 4 years ago, when it was brought to my attention that there had been a significant spike in deaths attributable to opioid drugs in our state, and it has only accelerated since then. These are frightening numbers, Senator. The final statistics from 2015 reflect about 52,000 Americans lost their lives to drug overdoses that year, and we believe the 2016 projections may be over 60,000. It'll be some time before we have final numbers. More than half, a substantial proportion of those, are attributable to opioid drugs. When I first learned about this, we were talking about the heroin crisis, and people thought about heroin and oxycodone, which is a lawful prescription drug that often can be abused. Increasingly, the challenge we face is about fentanyl, which is an even more hazardous drug that poses a danger even to our first responders, our police, firefighters, and paramedics who are responding to the scenes of overdoses because of how deadly and dangerous that drug can be. So this is a very significant challenge to us. There are a lot of issues, a lot of ways that we can go about addressing it, one of which you talked about the gangs that bring drugs into your home state. I know from my experience as U.S. Attorney, that's an area where our federal prosecutors and our DEA agents can do a lot of good. Law enforcement isn't the only solution to the heroin and opioid crisis, but from our perspective, it's an important part. It's one of the key tools the Department of Justice has, is to target these organizations, try to identify the sources of supply, and put those drug dealers out of business. So one of the most important things I think that we're going to do this year under this budget is that we are going to be able to fund about 900 additional employees for DEA. Now, these are not new positions. My understanding from our budget experts is these are positions that are existing, but for the most part were not filled because of budgetary constraints. So we anticipate we'll have up to 900 more personnel on the front lines of the DEA. We'll have additional federal prosecutors, and that, from the department's perspective, will help us to combat that. But if I may continue, it's not just about law enforcement. There are many other areas in which many other ways that we can combat drug abuse. The Justice Department obviously focuses primarily on law enforcement, but we do have these grant programs that allow us to do other things. The COPS program, as you mentioned, is proposed to be eliminated in this budget, but we request, there's a $7 million funding that I think is not in this year's budget, but we do request $40.4 million in additional federal funding for DEA, prescription opioid, and heroin enforcement programs. So this is a matter of not of reducing our emphasis on that issue, but of reprioritizing the money to places we think it will be more effective. This will allow DEA to expand funding for its 360 strategy, which is intended to illustrate that it's not just about law enforcement, it's a 360-degree program to try to reduce drug abuse. It'll allow us to enhance operations against domestic cartels that are responsible for drug distribution, and to enhance and establish regulatory and enforcement groups in the diversion control program and increase funding for our prescription drug disposal programs, because often drugs that are legally prescribed and not used then may be diverted to illegal uses. So through all of those ways, Senator, I can commit to you that we are very much attuned. I'm going to be watching those. I will be watching those overdose numbers, and I will not be satisfied until I see that trend turn around and start going the other direction.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Deputy Attorney General, thank you for being here. Could you describe in as clear and quick of a fashion as possible the scope of Attorney General Sessions' recusal?
Senator, the Attorney General Sessions' recusal is in the public record. And I understand I've been asked this question several times. Now, from my perspective, as you know, I've been, in matters in which he's recused, I'm the acting Attorney General. And therefore, I know what we're investigating. He does not. And I think that's what's important for you to recognize. He actually does not know what we're investigating, and I'm not going to be talking about it publicly.
But I guess the question is, how does he, so in the Attorney General's, what appears to be the only statement that Jeff Sessions made on this, I may be incorrect, but the main statement was March 2nd, 2017, I've decided to recuse myself from any existing or future investigations of any matters related in any way to the campaigns for President of the United States. So are we to understand that to the extent that there may be a counterintelligence investigation not related to campaigns for the President of the United States, or even a criminal investigation that could be obstruction of justice or a violation of another statute? So who decides where the line is? Because that seems to be about a particular thing. And now we have a special counsel and we have multiple investigatory processes going on. We also have public policy questions related to how we interact with the country that was engaged in active measures against us. So the question again is, who decides what he's recused from, and why is there no clarity on what he's recused from?
So, Senator, I think within the department, we do have clarity. And the reason for that is that there's a career ethics official who made that determination in conjunction with the Attorney General before I arrived. I arrived, I believe, around April 27th or 28th. And that career official works in the deputy's office. And so I am able to consult with him if any questions arise about what matters the Attorney General is recused from. And that's why,
Can you tell the public what matters the Attorney General is recused from?
Well, what I'm trying to explain, Senator, is it would be inappropriate for me to do that because he's recused from Department of Justice investigations, and we don't talk about the subject matter of investigations while they're ongoing. That would interfere with what our investigators and prosecutors are doing.
So normally, I think in a law firm or even in a public agency where there's a recusal, there's a memorialization of that recusal. There's a delineation of what is in and what is out of that recusal, and there's also a process by which we can determine whether or not there's compliance with that recusal. Is there such a document?
The way the department operates is very different from a law firm.
I know that, but is there such a document?
No, because it's not necessary. Because the department is a hierarchy, and so nothing gets to the Attorney General about the matters he's recused from unless they come through my office.
What if they come through the Oval Office?
If they come through the Oval Office? Well, we're not briefing the Oval Office about our investigations either, so I don't know how they would get there.
I am struggling, and it could be my lack of a law degree. Maybe there are a couple of lawyers on this panel or in the public who can help me to understand the most basic question here, which is that the Attorney General had a press conference and said, given all of these challenges, given all of this controversy, I'm out. I am recused from these matters. And now the question becomes, what matters? Which matters? So I'm just going to ask one final time, if you can just try to describe for the public, for the layperson, for the person who's following this but may not possess a law degree, what is the Attorney General allowed to be involved in, and what is he not allowed to be involved in? And who makes that determination, and how do we know whether he's complying or not?
Yeah, I appreciate that sincere question, Senator. I want to try to explain, and you're right, I've spent 27 years in the Department of Justice. I think about these things differently than people who are not in the department and not lawyers. What's important for me to explain, in this matter, I'm acting as Attorney General of the United States. And that means a lot to me, and one of the things it means is that I have a responsibility not to talk publicly about what we're investigating or who we're investigating, because that could adversely affect the investigation, and because it would be unfair to people who may be under investigation.
Is it possible that the Attorney General is a witness in this investigation?
If he were, Senator, I wouldn't talk about it.
What about you?
Senator, I'm not going to be talking about the investigation. The purpose of my appointment of Special Counsel Mueller was to ensure that there would be public confidence in the outcome of that investigation, and he now has responsibility for that. And I think that if there are any questions, they should be directed to him. And I know he's going to do the right thing, as I would, and defend the integrity of that investigation.
If you were, just one final question, because I'm over time. If you become a witness in this investigation, do you think there's a conflict of interest there?
I'm not going to answer hypothetical questions, and the reason, Senator, is I am working with career professionals who know these rules and are responsible for enforcing these rules, and I can assure you that we're going to do the right thing, and we're going to defend the integrity of that investigation.
Can you just consider this a question for the record? If you could please put in black and white for the committee the scope of the recusal and how this all works, and I think then you can be a little more careful. I mean, I understand you have to be careful about not referring to an investigatory process. I get that. But still, I think the public deserves to know exactly how this all plays out, and I can't imagine that you can't describe it, even in the abstract, so that we are assured that there is a fair and thorough investigatory process. Thank you.
I appreciate the question, and we will make an effort to do that in writing in a way that may be, hopefully, better than my efforts. But as I said, I just want to assure you and assure everybody, that's what I'm about here, is making sure that the rule of law is followed and that we reach a fair result in which people can have confidence. And I'm working with career professionals in the department who are going to help me to do that.
Senator Lankford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rosenstein, thanks for being here. You've testified in front of every senator in closed sessions. You've testified in front of the Intelligence Committee in open sessions. You've had lots of conversations on this. So I appreciate you being here again today. We'll go through some budget areas. I do want to help clarify one thing. I read with some interest in the paper that there was some secret plan to be able to privately remove the special counsel who you just put in place. To be able to see that, all I could think about was Jim Comey's statements publicly saying how many times he read newspaper stories with unnamed sources that as he read them, he thought these are completely false. Is there anything to some secret plan that's out there from you or anyone in the administration to try to go and remove the special counsel?
There is no secret plan that involves me, no, Senator.
I would just say no one in America is above the law, and no one in America is not faced with accountability and checks and balances. Every one of us has checks and balances. The president, every member of the cabinet, the vice president, every judge has checks and balances in the system. I can't seem to understand the fascination to say we need to create some special counsel that would be the only person in America that has no accountability structure anywhere for anything. I would assume everyone has a check and balance somewhere, but that doesn't mean it's under consideration in the process. So I appreciate you trying to clarify that for us. I do want to also thank you in the Department of Justice. Senator Warren and I do not agree on everything, but last year we started working on a process for the Department of Justice to stop the slush funds in the background where the Department of Justice was forcing businesses to be able to spend money in third-party groups or not revealing the nature of those settlements. The Department of Justice just last week announced that you are stopping that process, and I just want to say thank you. That's something we've worked on for a couple of years, trying to get accomplished legislatively. The previous administration would not work with us on. You just implemented that, and so I just want to be able to say I appreciate that. Let me also say that I have a question about the Crime Victims Fund and the rescission. Help me understand the rescission back to the Treasury of a part of the Crime Victims Fund.
Yes, Senator, thank you. The department's budget requests $3 billion from the Crime Victims Fund for fiscal year 2018. This will build on almost $8 billion provided for crime victims over the last 3 years. It includes $2.2 billion in formula grants for victims' compensation and assistance grants, $25 million to improve the treatment of crime victims, and 5% or $150 million is set aside for tribal governments. The $1.3 billion rescission is a cut from excess balances because of record high collections in the past. And I have to tell you, Senator, I'm a business school graduate. This is government budgeting. I know it can be complex. I've talked with the career professionals in the department, and they've explained to me that's what that number represents. It represents a cut of excess balances because there have been record high collections in the past. But we are recommending the spending of $3 billion in the next fiscal year.
So let me tell you why this is so important, and this committee will know this well. For the last 2 years in our subcommittee and in the full committee, I've raised the issue of the Crime Victims Fund. The Crime Victims Fund was set aside as dollars that have come into it specifically for use to be able to help, by definition, crime victims. It has been used in that in multiple areas in multiple places completely appropriately. What has happened, though, is that because it has an excess balance, this year around $9 billion, Congress says we're planning to spend that and then doesn't spend that and takes that $9 billion and actually spends it somewhere else on paper. And then the next year spends the same $9 billion again on paper. It's a $9 billion of excess spending above our budget caps that are done. You may know it as the changes in mandatory programs, or what's affectionately called around here CHIMPs. I have raised for the last 2 years in this committee and in the full committee the possibility that those dollars would be spent one time and then couldn't be spent again the same dollars next year, year after year. I've so far been unsuccessful to be able to do that. Now you're bringing in another element of this, of a rescission to be able to move it. I'm trying to figure out how do we get transparency in budgeting, that the Crime Victims Fund is used for victims of crime, that it's not used as an offset for our budget here, and it's not used as a rescission somewhere else back to Treasury. It's actually used for victims of crime. And any way that we can get transparency and to be able to actually use that fund what it was originally intended for, rather than a budget gimmick here or rescission there, I'm in favor of. How can we work together to be able to solve this?
Well, Senator, I appreciate that question. And I have reviewed this issue of the changes in mandatory program, or CHIMPs. As I know you recognize, it's a very technical issue of budget and appropriations.
But it's not technical that we overspend an additional $9 billion on paper, but nowhere else gets to see it.
Well, that's not a Justice Department issue, though. I think that's a broader
Right.
OMB issue.
That's us.
Yes, I don't think it's a question that I'm best positioned to answer. I think OMB would be the right agency to answer that question.
Well, I hope to be able to work together on that, not only to be able to solve this rescission issue and to figure out how we actually use those dollars for victims of crime, rather than go back to Treasury, but also as we solve that issue long-term for us, that budget gimmick goes away. I'll try to follow up with a question for the record on private prisons that I know you're trying to re-engage with in that, and we'll follow up in the days ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Coons?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, thank you for being here today. Obviously, you're here because Attorney General Sessions abruptly canceled his commitment to appear before this committee. It is Attorney General Sessions' job to be here today, and the fact that he has again chosen to skip this hearing is unacceptable. And the Attorney General, I believe, has chosen to skip this hearing today in order to avoid difficult questions about the scope of his recusal, questions which have already been asked of you by several senators, but I'll attempt to explore it a little bit more further. And I do think it's important that we have a full and engaged conversation with the Attorney General about the Department of Justice in front of both the Judicial Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for the entity he still leads. But let me start briefly with some good news, if I might. Mr. Rosenstein, you're here in part to talk about the budget of the Department of Justice. In 2014, Congress demonstrated its commitment to the Victims of Child Abuse Act by unanimously authorizing that in both chambers. And the Children's Advocacy Centers funded by this law conduct important forensic interviews that help serve law enforcement needs and meet the needs of child victims. And I'm pleased the President's FY18 budget request fully funds these programs. So I thought we'd start with at least one positive thing we could talk about.
Thank you.
As has been discussed by several others, it is the scope of recusal that is utterly unclear, both to lawyers and non-lawyers on this committee. You're here instead of the Attorney General, and you're here as acting Attorney General with regard to the Special Counsel, and you exercised the hire and would exercise the fire decision with regards to Special Counsel Bob Mueller. And that's because Attorney General Sessions is recused from that matter. On May 9th, you delivered a memo to Attorney General Sessions entitled Restoring Public Confidence in the FBI. And your memo exclusively focused on Director Comey's conduct during the Clinton email investigation and concluded, quote, the way the director handled the conclusion of that investigation was wrong. And you ultimately stated, having refused to admit his errors, the director cannot be expected to implement the necessary corrective actions. Is that roughly correct? Am I citing that memo?
I believe it is, yes.
And on that same day, Attorney General Sessions then sent a memo to President Trump relying exclusively on your memo where the Attorney General recommends Director Comey be removed. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And during his January 10 confirmation hearing, AG Sessions stated he would recuse himself from any matters involving campaigns for President of the United States and specifically investigations into Secretary Clinton's email server. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, Senator.
So why did you write a memo to Attorney General Sessions exclusively discussing a matter that, as I understand it, Attorney General Sessions explicitly told us in Congress he was recused from? And why was that an appropriate basis for him to make a hire fire recommendation to the President on?
Well, Senator, I don't think that's a question for me to answer. I have said in my previous briefings of the Senate and the House that my memo truthfully reflects my views. I'm not in position to comment on anybody else. So from my perspective, Senator, that memo is about what it's about. I do not know what was in anybody else's mind. I understand there are serious allegations that have been raised, and I think that it's up to Director Mueller to determine in the first instance whether any of these issues are within the scope of his investigation. That's why I haven't commented on it. I just appointed him several weeks ago. I haven't talked to him about the substance of the investigation since then. But I recognize the importance of these questions, and I think that Director Mueller ought to review that and make a determination of whether or not he believes it is within the scope of his investigation.
I appreciate that answer. It is distinct from an answer I got from you previously in another setting, so I want to make sure I understand you.
Well,
and I'll proceed carefully, and let's see if we can get to an answer that's appropriate in a public setting. Is it not your argument that the Attorney General made a recommendation to hire or fire the FBI director because that's outside his recusal, that the scope of his recusal doesn't affect his ability to manage the department?
I do have a personal opinion about that, Senator. I just don't think it's appropriate for me to be expressing my personal opinion about that. I hope I haven't said anything inconsistent with what I've said elsewhere, and please let me know if I have. But yeah, I do not want to comment on the recusal. I think the Attorney General made the decision to recuse. I wasn't there at the time, as you know, and there were processes. The decisions had already been made before I arrived about what matters would be appropriate for the Attorney General to handle. When I stepped in, I continued consistent with what had been done by these career professionals in the department, and I believe that I have faithfully, within the department, honored that recusal with regard to matters pending the Department of Justice. But I just don't want to comment on what may have been in anybody else's mind or offer any opinion about that, because it's not for me to make those decisions.
Well, it is exactly, I think, why Senator Schatz asked a whole series of questions about the scope of recusal, because I am a lawyer. Senator Schatz may not be. He asked better questions than I did. But I also am having real difficulty understanding the scope of the recusal, its contours and definition. And I have an unresolved question about whether or not that's why the Attorney General failed to appear before us today, is to avoid having to answer direct questions about the scope of his recusal. I do appreciate and respect your appointment of a highly talented special counsel, and there have been questions from both sides that imply strong support for his independence and his conduct, and I appreciate the care with which you are answering my questions, but I'm simply going to conclude by saying I have unanswered questions that perhaps can only be answered by the Attorney General himself, and it is my hope that we will have him appear before both the Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Committee charged with overseeing the funding for the department he is currently directing. Thank you.
Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenstein. Why isn't Jeff Sessions here today?
Well, Senator, my understanding is consistent with what was in the Attorney General's letter. I don't know of any other reasons beyond what he set forth publicly.
Okay. It's 13 June. Do you know of any reason for a cause to fire Mr. Mueller as of this date?
No, I do not, Senator.
And that would be your decision if that ever happened, right?
That's correct.
And you're going to make it, nobody else?
As long as I'm in this position, Senator, it will be my responsibility to make that decision.
Well, I'm glad you're in this position. Is giving political donations a reason to disqualify somebody for serving in the special counsel's office?
No, Senator, it is not a disqualification. It is not.
As a matter of fact, many states, their judges and prosecutors are actually elected. Donations are part of that system, is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Would it be a disqualification for somebody in the special counsel's office who had represented Ms. Clinton in the past to serve?
Senator, it would depend on the facts and circumstances. As a general matter, I think the answer is no.
Isn't that much closer to a conflict of interest?
I don't want to answer a hypothetical, Senator. Everybody needs to make a determination based upon the facts and circumstances.
How would you get it before the special counsel? What process could a member of the Senate use to inform the special counsel that you'd have a concern about hiring somebody that represented Clinton?
We have a process within the Department of Justice, Senator, so I would encourage you, if you have those concerns, to raise them with Director Mueller or to raise them with me, and I'll make sure that
Should I do it to you or him?
Well, you could do it to both.
Okay.
And we have career.
And I don't know if I'll do that, but I've read some things that were, I don't think donations are disqualifying at all, but if you represented the Clinton Foundation or Clinton herself, that would be a bit disturbing to me, but I'll take care of that. As to Russia, do you have any doubt that the 17 intelligence agencies report that was submitted last year or early this year that Russia interfered in our election is accurate?
So, Senator, this was an issue that was discussed at my confirmation hearing, and several of you attended that. At that point, I had access only to the public information, from which classified information.
So what can you tell us now?
I now have access to classified information, and I think that assessment made by the intelligence community is justified based upon the investigation and the evidence they had.
Thank you very much. What role did you play in crafting this budget? Where did this budget come from for the Department of Justice?
I appreciate that question, Senator. The budget actually is a product primarily of career professionals in the department. It's $27.7 billion. It's very complicated. Some of them are actually seated behind me, but they have a whole team behind them, and I suspect there are dozens of folks who've been involved.
Was it their desire to cut the budget by 2%, or did that come from OMB?
Senator, I do not know the answer to that, but let me just make clear.
Could you find that answer?
We're accountable for that. That is the political leadership of the department. We're accountable for that. I'm not in any way suggesting those were their decisions. They faithfully implement the priorities that are given to them. So I do not mean to shed responsibility for the bottom line, but the assistance that we have in preparing the budget.
Well, it's a simple question. Were you directed to cut the budget by 2%, or did you agree to cut the budget? But did that come within the Department of Justice or a mandate outside the Department of Justice?
I honestly do not know the answer to that.
Well, that's all right.
Try to find out.
You can get back to me. In terms of threats to the country, are they going up or down?
I wouldn't want to. I haven't done a study, so I wouldn't want to characterize it. Well, I think everybody recognizes the terrorist threat is extremely serious.
Will we have more FBI agents under this budget or less than we did last year?
I believe we'll have. I apologize, Senator. I'm consulting.
I'm actually asking budget questions, so I don't want to throw you off here.
I appreciate the budget questions. According to the numbers that I have, the FBI will have an increase of 150 for a total of 12,484.
So there'd be more agents by 150. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, Senator. We can let me check that and get back to you.
Thank you. Do you agree that the FBI, Department of Justice, is national security in another form in many ways?
I'm sorry?
Is national security in another form, that the role of the Department of Justice is a national security role as well as a domestic role?
Well, actually, my answer, Senator, is it's national security in reality and in another form. And we actually
So here's my final question. We're dramatically increasing the Defense Department because it has suffered mightily over sequestration. Can you make an argument that if you are a national security component of our overall defense strategy, why we would cut you now, given the threats we face?
Yeah, Senator, I believe that if you look at the budget, we are not cutting the critical areas. Violent crime, terrorism, the areas that you've raised are areas where there will be no cuts. Cybercrime, all of those areas. And so the effort in this budget, as I understand it, is to reduce only in areas that are not critical to those operations. It's an effort to be more efficient, to achieve the goals of the American people. But I can assure you, that our goal is to use these resources more effectively to reduce crime, to reduce drug abuse, and to fight terrorism. And so we are not going to relent in our commitment to those goals.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Deputy Attorney General, good to see you. I will say, as many of my colleagues have, that it's the height of arrogance for the Attorney General not to come before the committee that oversees the Justice Department budget. That being said, I'm glad to have you here. As you know, during the confirmation process, you, Ed, and I had a conversation about the consent decree between the Justice Department and the Baltimore City Police Department and Baltimore City. Since our conversation, the courts have approved that consent decree. And I just want your continued assurance that you will work in your capacity as Deputy Attorney General to make sure that we further that agreement and make sure that we can get the parties together and move it along.
Senator, our goal is to reduce violent crime and protect constitutional rights in Baltimore. That consent decree, as you know, is in effect. I know you're aware, and it's very painful to me, we have a crisis in violent crime in Baltimore. And the murder rate this year is on track at the moment actually to reach a record high. In 2017, we may have a record high murder rate in Baltimore City. So we need to do everything we can to support our local partners, and we are working in many ways to support that local police department. Last year, we had about 318 murders. The year before, about 342. And we're on track now potentially to have more in Baltimore this year. So that is a very high priority for me. Although I'm no longer there physically every day, I'm very engaged with that, and I'm going to continue to work with our authorities, with the federal agencies, and with our U.S. Attorney's Office to do anything that we can to help support our partners in Baltimore and turn around that trend in violence in that city.
I appreciate that. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on what is an unacceptable increase in the murders. Any crime increase or any crime is unacceptable, but seeing the spike is something we've got to tackle with urgency. I do want to follow up on some of my colleagues' questions regarding the special counsel, and it's especially pressing in light of these reports that did come out yesterday that folks at the White House, maybe the president, were looking at ways to fire the special counsel Mueller. And as you already testified today, given the current situation, you are the only person today in a position to actually do that firing. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And as I understand your testimony, you said that this is a matter that's within your jurisdiction. So based on that, I would assume it would be a violation of the Attorney General's recusal if he were to try to fire the special counsel. Isn't that right?
I do not expect that to happen, Senator.
Okay. But it would be a violation of his recusal. This is now a matter that's under your jurisdiction, so it would be a violation of his recusal were he to attempt to do so.
I think that's probably fair, but that is not going to happen.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I'm actually more worried about the scenario at this point where if you were to receive an order from the White House to fire the special counsel, I'm less worried about you doing it because you've just testified today that you would only do it based on good cause. I'm worried about, in those circumstances, the president trying to keep going until he found someone willing to take that action. So my question relates to the definition of good cause, because you were very clear in your testimony that the authority to remove the special counsel is based on a finding of good cause. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And is an order from the president to fire the special counsel good cause?
It doesn't matter who the order comes from. Good cause would be based on the reasons for the proposed removal.
Right. And removing the special counsel in order to prevent the special counsel from pursuing the investigation, that would not constitute good cause, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So if somebody else were to fire the special counsel, in other words, if the president were to find somebody to do it, my question is what is the protection in that good cause definition? In your view, could the special counsel contest his firing if the special counsel did not believe it was good cause?
Now, Senator, I hope I won't have to answer that hypothetical. The purpose of that regulation, the folks who wrote it put a lot of thought into it, and they anticipated that people would follow the rules. Your question is, well, what if somebody doesn't follow the rules? What happens next? We have a lot of very well-informed folks and great lawyers in the department who would deal with that if it were to arise, but I do not anticipate that it's going to arise.
So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, I'm hoping it doesn't arise either, but we all know that there are scenarios even that have some historical precedent where this kind of question could arise. So my question is, would the department, or in this case, would the special counsel have recourse in the courts arguing that there was not good cause for the firing.
Yeah, I just don't know the answer to that, Senator, and I hope we'll never reach that point. I can tell you, as long as I'm in this position, he's not going to be fired without good cause. And if he were, it wouldn't be my responsibility. But that's like a law school hypothetical, and I'd be reluctant to answer it without doing some research first.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Deputy Attorney General. I had a conversation in my office with the Attorney General prior to his confirmation, and we spoke about the Department of Justice's government-to-government work with the tribes. He admitted to me at that time that his familiarity with the some 229 tribes in Alaska was limited. It was important for him to hear just the depth of some of the issues that we are facing as we deal with any level of law enforcement. So many of our communities have none whatsoever. And as a consequence, we are dealing with some very troubling statistics within our state. So I was pleased to note that the department is making grants for implementation of VAWA's special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction in the FY17, and then also requesting funds to continue that work in FY18. So that's good. I think that we have some things that we would like to discuss with you and your folks with regards to FY17 funding levels that are perhaps a bit problematic. Tribal court funding is again one that I have a great deal of interest with, but I do want to find a path forward with DOJ as it relates to some of the more immediate and very unique issues that we have as we deal with our tribal villages and the issues that they face. You would think that we are far enough away and remote enough that the opioid epidemic would not be hitting us in the state, but it is. The level of domestic violence and sexual assault that we face in terms of the statistics, the uptick of violent crime that we are seeing in urban Alaska. These are areas that we believe deserve a more specific approach, and we would like to work with you. We have invited and welcomed the Attorney General, as well as you, as others within the Department of Justice, to come up to the state to sit down with some of our Native leadership to discuss these issues. I again would reiterate that and essentially ask for your continued willingness to work with us in perhaps some innovative ways to address the issue of justice and law enforcement in rural Alaska.
Yes, Senator, thank you. I welcome that opportunity. We didn't have this issue in my home state of Maryland, but many of my colleagues in the past two administrations, U.S. attorneys, have talked with me about the challenges that we have on those Native American issues. And I met early in my tenure as Deputy Attorney General with the Director of our Tribal Justice Office, Tracy Toulouse, and talked about some of these issues. So I would certainly welcome the opportunity to work with you on that.
Good. We need to do that. Let me switch gears a little bit. We've been talking about opioids and addiction, but let's talk about another issue. Alaska is one of those states that has not only enacted medical marijuana statutes, but we, through ballot initiative, have allowed for a broader sale and use of marijuana that is regulated as we would regulate alcohol. In the state, we think that the regulatory regime is a fairly strong one and consistent with the Cole Memorandum. Now, that memorandum suggests that the federal government will not get in the way of states which maintain strong regulatory regimes. I had some correspondence with the prior Attorney General Lynch, relating to this. But the fact is the banking sector is still closed to those in the marijuana business, making it difficult for states to access a paper trail to ensure that those in the business are compliant. We recently heard that postal inspectors believe that they can seize state tax payments sent by mail from people in the marijuana business. Now I understand that DOJ wants to eliminate the appropriations rider prohibiting federal interference with state medical marijuana laws. So I'm concerned, and I'm speaking for a lot of people in my state who are worried about the inconsistency between the state marijuana laws as well as the federal policy. The Department of Justice has not taken the position thus far that state marijuana laws are completely preempted by the Controlled Substance Act. I don't know if you're headed in that direction. The Cole Memorandum suggests strong deference to state laws, but we're not seeing the federal government doing much to ensure that those strong state laws are enforceable. So the bigger question is where are we headed with marijuana?
I appreciate your concern about that, Senator. It's a very difficult issue, obviously, a situation where we do have a conflict between federal law and the law in some states. It's a difficult issue for parents of teenagers like me who have to provide guidance to our kids about how they should treat marijuana.
Believe me, I agree with that, yeah.
But I can tell you, I've talked with Chuck Rosenberg, the director of DEA, about this, the administrator of DEA, and we follow the law and the science. And from a legal and scientific perspective, marijuana is an unlawful drug. It's properly scheduled under Schedule 1, and therefore we have this conflict. Jim Cole tried to deal with it in that memorandum, and at the moment that memorandum is still in effect. Maybe there will be changes to it in the future, but we're still operating under that policy, which is an effort to balance the conflicting interests with regard to marijuana. And so I can assure you that's going to be a high priority for me as the new U.S. attorneys come on board to talk with them about how to deal with that challenge in the states that have legalized or decriminalized marijuana, whether it be for recreational or medical use. But we are still in the Department of Justice, as Attorney General Lynch actually mentioned this at her hearing, her confirmation hearing in January 2015, and she explained that we're responsible for enforcing the law. It's illegal, and that is the federal policy with regard to marijuana.
Confusing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Feinstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to say that I associate myself with the remarks of Senator Shaheen and Senator Collins. Yesterday, Mr. Rosenstein, I was in New York, and a distinguished lawyer came up to me after I finished speaking and said, beware, this president is going to act to terminate the special counsel. And I said, he couldn't possibly do that. It would be catastrophic. And he said, just wait. I came home and turned on the television and this morning, and that's what I heard. So it's very hard to know what to believe. I do believe it would be catastrophic, and I do believe it would destroy any shred of trust in the president's judgment that remains over here. I do not know with specifics what the procedure is if that were to happen, but as I understand what you said, that could not be done without your assent. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
And what you have said, you would not assent under the present situation.
Correct.
Because there's no cause.
Yes, that's correct.
So is it fair to put that to rest?
As far as I'm concerned, yes, Senator. I appointed him. I stand by that decision. I think it was the right thing to do under those circumstances, and I'm going to defend the integrity of that investigation.
Thank you. Let me go on to the COPS anti-methamphetamine grants. That's a program I helped establish in 2014. If I understand what you said very quickly, the cut is $7 million in meth and $10 million in heroin, but the addition is $40.4 million for DEA. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, Senator, and I've been briefed by our career officials actually are whispering in my ear that, yes, that is correct.
Good.
We are going to commit more resources to combating heroin and opioid drugs over the next year.
Good. So the COPS anti-methamphetamine program will remain intact.
I think, Senator, the answer to that is that what we intend to do is to fund task forces in a different way. I think that funding went directly to state and local law enforcement.
That's correct.
Our proposal is to fund it through DEA. So there will be task forces, but there'll be DEA task forces as opposed to state and local task forces.
So you're canceling the funding that goes to local police organizations.
The direct funding to establish those, the grants to establish those local task forces are proposed to be eliminated, but there's additional funding to DEA, which will be used to fund state and local officers who work with DEA.
So the answer is yes, you are defunding community police departments that participate.
I believe the answer is that we are proposing to defund that $7 million that went directly to local task forces.
Okay, I just want you to know that in California alone, in the past few months, there have been 61 arrests, 428 kilograms of meth seized, 242 kilograms of heroin, 1,728 kilograms of marijuana, and 11 firearms. So it is a very busy task force, and it no doubt, if the money is not there, could likely be eliminated. Secondly, there's a growing concern that the Russia investigation is taking too long. I heard a congressman this morning expressing that point of view. Mr. Comey briefed Senator Grassley and myself as the chairman and ranking of Judiciary 3 months ago, and it was a very full and good brief. Do you have any estimate as to the time this investigation will take or when we might be expected to have some conclusion?
Senator, I regret that I do not. The way our investigations are conducted, it depends upon a lot of factors. And so it's generally very difficult for us to predict in advance how long the investigation is going to take. I can assure you it's important to me that it be done expeditiously, and I communicated that to Director Mueller, and I'm sure he also appreciates the importance of moving as quickly as we can. How do we move it expeditiously? Well, it requires having appropriate resources, which I believe we do have and always have had to conduct the investigation, and making good decisions about how to go about conducting that investigation, and I believe we can rely on Director Mueller to do that.
So there is no estimate as to when we might expect some resolution?
Correct.
Okay. Let's go to the wall. It's my understanding that for the 600 miles of wall, there are 400 lawsuits pending. Is that correct?
Senator, I don't believe that I have a number for you. I regret we don't. I can try to get back to you on that. I don't have a number.
Now, and my understanding is you've put additional attorneys in the budget to handle these. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And how many are there?
Well, Senator, we have proposed a total of 27 additional attorneys in the civil and environmental divisions and $4 million that will be available to defend the government and meet litigation requirements associated with increased immigration enforcement. That's not just about the wall. It's about immigration enforcement, but it would include any litigation that arose.
And that would be the 400 cases that are now pending. What is your estimate of lawsuits on the remainder of the wall?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that. I can look into it and try to get back to you, but I don't know.
Well, I really would like you to, because I think it's going to be extraordinary. I think as you get into the Rio Grande Valley, you're going to find that property owners, as I hear, are not very pleased. And I think we ought to know about it as we budget. So could I ask that you get back to me prior to the time we mark this bill up?
I can try to give you whatever information we have. Pardon me, Senator. I can give you whatever information that we have. It's important to keep in mind, though, that we're the lawyers on these issues, but it's actually Homeland Security that would have the primary responsibility for operational decisions. So I'll give you whatever we can, but I think Homeland Security might be in better position to comment on that.
We will approach that. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Bozeman for his courtesy. Mr. Rosenstein, welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Rosenstein, thank you. I remember.
Just like Feinstein.
I remember. That's easy for me to remember. We work together all the time. I'm going to ask you about something a little different, maybe refreshing for you. Probably not at the top of your agenda, but I hope it'll be on your agenda as time goes on. outdated federal consent decrees, and specifically how such things affect songwriters in Nashville. Outdated federal consent decrees. In 2006, I introduced legislation based upon a book called Democracy by Decree, What Happens When Courts Run Government. It was by Professors Sandler and Schoenbrod, who were attorneys for the National Resources Defense Council. It was about the growing number of federal consent decrees that seemed to manage everything. A lot of it had to do with education, some with the environment, some with clean air litigation, variety of other things, and it took these issues out of the hands of legislators, and courts were running the government. So in general, the legislation would have allowed newly elected governors, mayors, and legislators to file motions to vacate the consent decrees and put those issues back out in the democratic process. Let me talk about one example of that. It has to do with songwriters. Might not seem very important in Washington, D.C., but we have thousands of them in Nashville. It's the center of songwriting. Most of them are waiters and bus drivers and teachers in the meantime, hoping to make a big hit. 75 years ago, the Justice Department noticed some antitrust implications on the two organizations that regulates how songwriters are paid for their work. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, I was with some songwriters, and I had gone outside a pharmacy, and I saw an old couple there, and I said, "How are you all doing?" And the lady said, "We're just falling apart together." So I mentioned that to the songwriters, Lee Brice and Billy Montana and another songwriter. They said, "I think we could do something with that." And they wrote a song called Falling Apart Together. Lee Brice put it on one of his albums, and I get a fourth of the royalties for that because that's the way Nashville works. If the four of us write a song, we each split it up. Last year I got $110 for my royalty, even though it's on Lee Brice's album, and he's a pretty well-known singer. That's the first problem. Under the consent decree that's 75 years old, you've got a rate court that sets what the songwriters get paid. It doesn't reflect the market value. The second is more immediate. Your department issues regulations and interpretations of regulations based upon the consent decrees. One recent regulation said that if Lee Brice and I and Billy Montana and another writer are sitting around writing, that we have to check and see who represents us, and that any one of us can go out and find that person and make a deal with a bar or a restaurant that affects all the others of us. And it would turn the common, ordinary, everyday practice of songwriting in Nashville upside down. And I'm not surprised that someone in the Department of Justice wouldn't know that you co-write songs. You just sit down informally. You might spend a weekend, write 6 songs. But what this would do is just tear that all apart, cause these songwriters, not wealthy people, to have to consult lawyers, make agreements, do all this kind of thing. The songwriters have appealed the Justice Department interpretation. The court, federal district court, agreed with that. Now you're appealing it further to a higher court. So my request of you is not for you to answer me today on how to solve that problem, but one, would you put on your agenda somewhere the general issue of democracy by decree, outdated federal consent decrees, and consider whether it's not time to give governors and mayors and legislators an opportunity to file motions to vacate those consent decrees and get them back in the hands of the democratic process. And second, will you consider the Department of Justice interpretation that's now an appeal to a federal district court that if you're successful, will turn the everyday business of songwriting in Nashville upside down? I'm sure it's not what's intended by the Department of Justice, but that would be the practical effect.
Senator, I happen to be a country music fan. It's something I passed on to my daughter, so I'm tempted to comment. But
it's all right with me if you do.
As you recognize, there is pending litigation, and I'm not at liberty to comment on the pending litigation. But I do want to comment on the general issue with regard to consent decrees. I think there are some questions that we should ask with regard to proposed consent decrees. Will it help solve a problem? How do we evaluate success? How do we know if it's working? How much is it going to cost, and when will it end? I think those are appropriate questions to the extent that we are considering imposing consent decrees. And as I'm sure you recognize, a consent decree is consent between the parties, and so there are always opportunities to revisit if there's agreement among the parties. If there's not, then there may be litigation, as you mentioned. But I regret I don't have any opinion to offer on the proposed legislation, but I can assure you that we will, when there are consent decree issues in the department, we'll think very seriously about all those and other issues.
I thank you for your answer. And the consent decree under which the lawsuit and the rate court are established was put in place in 1941. That seems to me to be too long to keep something out of the hands of the democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Manchin.
Mr. Rosenstein, it's good to have you here. And then one of the pressing questions I have right now is, did the couple that was falling apart together get anything?
There wasn't anything left after each of the four songwriters got $110 for the year.
I understand. First of all, it's reassuring, sir, to hear that the system that you've put in place as far as the special prosecutor and Mr. Mueller, the confidence you have in him to do his job is quite assuring and comforting to all of us. Did you talk with Robert Mueller about his investigation and the resources that he might need to do his job the proper way? And do you feel he's sufficiently been supported in that effort?
I have not. Under the regulation, it actually tasks the Assistant Attorney General for our Justice Management Division to consult with Mr. Mueller about resources and budget. That gentleman happens to be sitting behind me, and he has talked with Mr. Mueller about it. I have not, but I can assure you he's going to get the resources he needs to conduct that investigation.
So there's not a concern there whether he'll be able to do the job the way he's intended to be done?
Yes, he will.
Okay. Mr. Rosenstein, could you be terminated without cause?
Yes.
And who would appoint your replacement as your position now, Deputy Attorney General?
The President.
So that's a possibility.
Anything's possible, Senator.
I understand. That's what we know. There's great concern in all of this, as you can tell, and I'm going to get another opportunity to talk to Attorney General Sessions in Intel meeting. So I know a lot of my colleagues here don't have the same opportunity, so they were a little bit concerned about him not being here. But I want to thank you for being here. In West Virginia, we have a devastating epidemic. We are a state that's got hit harder than any other state. We've lost more people per capita than any other state. We're doing everything humanly possible. We can't do it without the help of Attorney General's office, Department of Justice, everyone else is involved. I guess I would ask, what is your main approach to fighting the war on opiate addiction?
Yes. Well, thank you, Senator. This is an extremely high priority for me, and I'm very familiar with the opioid challenges in West Virginia. In fact, the U.S. attorneys in the Obama administration worked very closely with me on these issues and participated with us in meetings that we held in Baltimore and in the Capital Region about the opioid challenge, because some of the drugs that are in West Virginia are sourced to Baltimore, and so we had cases in common. And I'm aware of just how serious a problem this is in West Virginia. I have talked with the potential candidates for U.S. Attorney in your state and in others, and this is one of the issues that I talk about, that this is going to be one of the high priorities of this administration. I know you're aware that Attorney General Sessions actually traveled to Charleston in May. He gave opening remarks at the DEA 360 Heroin and Opioid Response Summit, and as I mentioned earlier, this 360-degree strategy recognizes the need to work in coordination with state and local officials, and it recognizes it's not just about law enforcement. It's about engaging all the community resources that we need to deter people from becoming drug addicts. And so we won't
Sir, if I could just, because I know our time, but I want you to comment on this. In Kermit, West Virginia, a little town in Mingo County, Kermit, West Virginia, population of 392 people. Out-of-state drug companies, basically, which are supply houses, legitimate businesses, sent 9 million highly addictive hydrocodone over 2 years to a town of 392 people. That's where we need, I mean, it's just unbelievable what's being sent. And of course, you know, we have an awful lot of ongoing suits going on right now against the drug suppliers. Are you all involved in those?
I'm not certain, Senator, whether we're involved in that particular litigation, but DEA does have a diversion strategy, a group that focuses on drug diversion. And we are certainly aware that a significant proportion of our opioid drug problem is a prescription drug problem. That is, drugs that are diverted from legitimate uses or are overprescribed to addicts. And that is a significant portion of the problem. And so I believe we need to work with the pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, pharmacists, and doctors, and identify folks who are overprescribing and make sure that we hold them accountable.
And my final one, because my time is running out, drug courts have had a tremendous impact on us, and we think it's been very positive. We're concerned about drug courts, the funding for drug courts in our state and all over this country. If you could tell me what your administration is supporting on drug courts or expansion of drug courts, continuing support for drug courts.
Yes, Senator, we are proposing funding for state, local, and tribal drug courts. There's $40 million proposed in the 2018 budget. That funding will enable them to develop and implement drug courts that include substance abuse treatment, along with mandatory drug testing, sanctions, and incentives, the goal being to transition people off of drugs. And that's part of a larger $100 million request for funding programs that support the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, or what some people refer to as CARA or CARA.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think Senator Bozeman is in front of me. He's just yielding right and left. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Deputy Attorney General, for being here. Mr. Rosenstein, I want to follow up on something my colleague from West Virginia began, which are the resources for the special counsel. You said, and you've said more than once, that you anticipate and that you know that the resources that will be needed to do a full investigation will be there in full measure for the special counsel, correct?
Yes.
What kind of oversight do you, because we know as appropriators and as folks who are looking over budgets that one way to squeeze or change the direction is to have tighter oversight or to squeeze down on the resources available. Do you have the ability to do that, or do you tell Director Mueller that he can basically have whatever resources he needs to have? Who has the oversight over his budget, or is there such a thing?
Senator, I think within limits, he has oversight of his budget. Our administrative officers, Justice Management Division, I'm sure if they felt there was something inappropriate, they'd bring it to my attention. But I don't expect that to happen. I think that the resources will be reasonable and that there will be no dispute as to what he needs.
Or I would anticipate that as well. But thank you for that answer. I was going to go to drugs because that's a big issue, so I'm going to go. We just had Attorney General Sessions in the state of West Virginia to talk about DEA 360. Seems to be a good program that's gotten off to a great start in our state, which we have, as you're well aware of, much needed assistance. After the addiction, unfortunately, to painkillers, many people are moving to heroin. Much of this heroin is laced with fentanyl. Fentanyl's coming in, and it's believed to be coming in also through the U.S. mail from China. What is your department doing on that particular aspect?
You're correct, Senator. There are really two challenges with regard to fentanyl, which is many people aren't aware of fentanyl. They're going to become increasingly aware of it, unfortunately, over the coming year because it's an emerging threat. It can be small quantities of fentanyl, can be very dangerous, and they can be sent in the mail, and we are aware that fentanyl is coming in the United States primarily in two ways. It's coming in through the Mexican border, and it's coming in by mail from China.
Right.
And so we're going to need to work with DEA and with the Postal Inspection Service and try to find a way to cut down on that. And I think also with foreign authorities, we're going to need help from authorities in China and Mexico to deal with that challenge as well. So that is at the top of my agenda. As you know, I've been in this job only 6 weeks, but I've already talked with a number of folks, including Chuck Rosenberg, the administrator of DEA, and we're going to find a way to combat that threat.
Well, as you know, it's a killer, but it also affects our first responders. I read a story of a first responder, I believe they were in Ohio, who had been at the cleanup scene. Everything was sterilized and clean, but then at some point something came off of his glove and he ended up having to be revived from an overdose with just a minuscule exposure to something extremely dangerous. You also, I'm sure, are aware that the background check FBI facility is proudly located in West Virginia, and it is processing millions of background checks. I am concerned that in this year's budget, a rescission was implemented from the fees collected by CJIS that they have previously used to update their IT. We know how important IT infrastructure is to get it right in this very important issue. What can you say about that in terms of the support from your department for CJIS, and does this rescissions that are occurring this year, do you feel that what kind of impact that have? I have some concerns over that.
Senator, I'm not certain that I know about the rescission. I'm happy to look into that for you. I know our request includes $17 million in program increases for CJIS, so I think there's an overall increase. I don't have any information about the rescission.
Okay, let me ask you another question on over the years, we've been hearing about a backlog in sexual assault kit backlog, and the Department of Justice will the Department of Justice reverse this trend and mirror the sentiment expressed by this committee report, affirming a stronger commitment to increasing the necessary resources for this particular purpose under your direction?
You know, Senator, I know that is a very important challenge nationwide. I recall the district attorney, I believe, in Manhattan actually had made a priority of that last year. And we are committed to working with our state, local, and tribal partners to improve DNA and other forensics testing. This proposed budget includes $105 million for DNA-related and other forensic programs. And specifically with regard to your question, it includes $45 million for national sexual assault, for a national sexual assault kit initiative, and I think that will address your concerns.
Well, I would encourage you to move in that direction. I'm glad to see the department's doing that. Thank you so much.
Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Rosenstein, welcome.
Thank you.
The Justice Department sent letters to 9 jurisdictions alleged to be so-called sanctuary cities under 18 U.S.C. Section 1373. Where are we on that?
Yes, Senator, I believe we actually sent letters to 10 jurisdictions, and these were jurisdictions that had been identified by the Inspector General last year as jurisdictions that the Inspector General believed may have been in violation of Section 1373, and thereby potentially in violation of their obligation under grants to comply with federal law. And so we notified all 10 localities that they needed to certify to us that they were in fact complying with Section 1373. I believe we gave them until June 30th. And as of yesterday, we'd heard back from 3 that certified that they were in compliance. And so there's 7 that have not yet responded. But I anticipate, I hope, that we will have those responses by the end of the month.
Which 3 have you heard back from?
You know, I do not know that personally, Senator. I can check into it and get back to you.
Okay.
I don't know which 3 have already responded.
Have you heard from New Orleans?
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay. What if New Orleans comes back to you and says they're in compliance? Take my word for it.
Well, you know, as with all of our grants, Senator, you know, our primary, particularly when we're dealing with governments, our primary check is the certification, the self-certification that they provide, that they are in compliance with all the grant requirements. But there is an auditing capacity within the department, and so in some cases there may be reviews that are done by the granting authority, the Office of Justice Program, or, as happened last year, by our Inspector General. And if they found violations, we would have to deal with you know, the implications as we do in ordinary grants. I mean, as U.S. Attorney, I dealt with matters in which grant recipients had violated provisions of the grants, and then the question arises of, you know, what's the appropriate remedy? So, you know, so there is the potential for auditing and oversight of those certifications, but primarily we expect people, when they certify they're in compliance with the law, we expect them to be truthful about that. And I do want to let you know, Senator, that I do have, I just received from my staff a report that New Orleans is one of the 3 that has responded and has certified that it is complying. The other 2 are Clark County, Nevada, and the state of Connecticut.
I want to be sure, may I call you General? I don't want to call you Assistant General. General, I want to be sure I understand. The department sent letters to 10 jurisdictions that have alleged to be sanctuary cities and said, are you a sanctuary city? And You really expect them to write you back and say, yep?
No. Let me clarify for you, Senator. The request is, are you complying with Section 1373?
Right.
The sanctuary, whether it's defined as a sanctuary city, is really a different issue. Our requirement, as identified by the Inspector General, is, or our question is, are you complying with 1373? It's not whether or not you're a sanctuary city.
Well, to me, this issue is not. It is, of course, about immigration and legal immigration versus illegal immigration, but it's also about respect for the law. And our mayor in New Orleans, who is a friend of mine, on the one hand says, I'm in complete compliance with Section 1373. I'm not a sanctuary city. But on the other hand says publicly to the people of Louisiana, quote, I refuse to be a part of Trump's deportation force, close quote. Now, and this is America. You can believe what you want to believe, but we are a nation of laws, and we have laws that have to be followed. And if New Orleans disagrees with the law, it should petition Congress to change it. But it can't just unilaterally say, I don't like that. I'm the mayor. I don't like the president. I don't agree with his policy, so I'm not going to follow it, and make his comments personal in the process of doing that. That bothered me. So what's going to be done to follow up? I mean, let me make a prediction. All 10 cities are going to say they're in compliance.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I want to make sure I clarify this. If somebody certifies to the Department of Justice that they're in compliance, we expect them to be in compliance. And so it would be a very serious matter if somebody sends us a certification. That has to be signed by a person, and that person needs to be confident that they are right. If somebody signs a certification that they're in compliance, we are going to vigorously review those, particularly those 10, because they've already been identified for us by our Inspector General as jurisdictions where there was some concern. So we're going to vigorously review those submissions, and if they're not in compliance, and therefore they are in violation of the grant contract, we will pursue appropriate remedies. So those could include suspending an award, could include terminating a grant contract, and it could include requiring repayment of grant funds. So this is a very serious matter, Senator. If somebody sends a certification, we expect it to be accurate.
Well, I've gone over, but over what period of time are you going to check their compliance?
Well, there is, within the ordinary grant-making process, obviously there are a lot of conditions on federal grants. And there is a review process within the department, the Office of Justice Programs, and other grant-making components of the department. There's a potential for investigations by the Inspector General. And so we do review those in the ordinary course. And on a prospective basis, Senator, we're going to require these certifications that jurisdictions are in compliance with 1373. And I'm hopeful that people will, if they weren't following the law in the first place, that they will truthfully certify and make sure they change their practices so that they are following the law in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to go over. Thank you, Mr. General.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for yielding to Senator Alexander.
No, thank you.
You lost a little time that way.
No, it's fine. He had a good excuse. He was going to visit with the president. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to echo first what my colleagues have said about drug courts on both sides of the aisle. And that's something that really does reduce recidivism. They're doing a great job in Arkansas, both the regular drug court and then also the veteran drug courts, working with the VA, using the resources that they have. That's just a great partnership that really is making a big difference. I'm pleased that the DOJ has reinvested in a strategy that targets violent crime. I understand that you've created a violent crime strategy task force. Can you elaborate on the details, including what agencies are playing what roles, and do you have the necessary resources that you need to carry out the mission, which is so very, very important?
Yes, thank you, Senator. With regard to violent crime, as I know you're aware, in 2015, violent crime increased by more than 3%, which, just to put that in context, is the largest one-year increase we've experienced since 1991 nationwide. The number of murders in 2015 increased by 11%, which was the largest one-year increase since 1971. So we consider this to be an urgent problem for us. The Attorney General established a task force on violent crime reduction and public safety. That task force is drawing on expertise from throughout the department, to come up with strategies. And we have a number of proposals, some of which are in this budget, that will help us to reinvigorate our fight against violent crime, including I'm hopeful that we will be able to reinstitute what was referred to as Project Safe Neighborhoods. It was a program that I was involved in back in when I first became U.S. Attorney, and we hope to reinvigorate that program where we work together with our state and local partners to identify what are the violent crime problems in their communities and how can federal resources best be used to solve them. And I think the issue that you open with, Senator, is particularly important to me because these drug courts are primarily an issue for our state and local partners. They deal with, on a daily basis, a large volume of offenders, of people who've committed crimes who are drug addicts. In the federal system, typically, when we're prosecuting drug cases, they're distributors, not addicts, so we deal with a different type of defendant. But for our state and local partners, if they're able to help those folks overcome their drug addiction, they're going to be able to reduce crime. And so I think it is critically important for us to support those efforts.
Very good. I'm chairing the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee. One of our concerns is the number of immigration judges. We have, I believe, about a 500,000 backlog. I think there's $75 million to put more resources in there, more judges. Can you talk a little bit about that, the efforts that you're making in that regard, and kind of what the plan is to eliminate the backlog, how you're going to resource those judges?
There are really two ways, Senator, that we are acting immediately to try to deal with that backlog. The first is by filling existing vacancies, because there was a delay in filling immigration judge vacancies as they arose. And so we had a lot of judicial slots that were already funded but were vacant, and we are now moving quickly to fill those positions. In addition to that, our 2018 budget requests $500 million for the office in the department. It's called the Executive Office of Immigration Review. That's the office that handles those cases. And that will include $75 million for new judges, 75 new judges, and a total of 450 staff, which includes the folks to support those judges. And so once we get all those folks out into the field, we anticipate we're going to be able to make a big impact on that backlog. It'll represent a 21% increase in our overall staff, and we'll be able to adjudicate those immigration cases, I believe, much more fairly and expeditiously. And in addition to that, we're working to fill those 36 vacancies that already exist. We've already hired 38 immigration judges this year, and we hope to have a full complement, to have all of the 345 judicial slots filled by the end of the year.
Are you going to realign, or are you in the process of realigning where they're at? And teleconferencing, things like that, do we use those kind of technologies?
We're looking at alignment, as in where we need the judges. Certainly we're going to put them in the places we think they're most valuable. I do hope to look at ways that we can operate more efficiently. You mentioned teleconferencing. You use technology to move these cases quicker. I don't think there's any, it's not good for anybody to have these cases pending for so long. The director of our executive recently left the department. We now have an acting director, and I plan to work closely with him and with his successor when we appoint a permanent director. And the challenge that I've given to him is, let's fill the vacancies, but let's also figure out whether there are efficiencies that we can implement, ways that we can move these cases through the system more quickly, because I think that's in everybody's interest.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have several questions. Then I'll go to Senator Shaheen. The Justice Department, it's my understanding, currently holds over $4 billion in forfeited and seized assets in a fund set up to compensate victims of the Bernie Madoff fraud. The department is now in year 6 of the fund, and to date, to my knowledge, no assets have been disbursed to victims. In addition, news reports indicate that the special master of this fund has collected over $40 million in fees. Questions have been raised about the methodology of making distributions and determine the validity of claims, like everything else, yes, that these methodologies are unorthodox and unworkable. Obviously, they're not working if there's been no distribution. Would the department be inclined to review this matter? In other words, look at this, there's something wrong here, and see if there is a manner in which these distributions can be made more quickly and efficiently because the fund was set up to compensate the victims. You've been a prosecutor, still are. You got a comment on that?
Yes, sir, I agree with you. I think from the perspective of our prosecutors and agents, one of the most important things that we can do is to reimburse victims when we have funds available to do it. And I think we ought to
that was the purpose of the fund, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct, and we should do it as quickly as possible. As I understand, I just learned about this issue this week, Senator, and so I need to look into it a bit more. But my understanding is the problem here was the volume of claims that we received. I understand 65,000 claims, and so it's a process of making sure that each one of those is dealt with individually, and then we don't distribute the money until we're confident about the pool of people who ought to receive it. So I do appreciate your concern, and I can commit to you I'm going to look into that and figure out why it's taking so long.
Will you get back to the committee on this?
Yes, sir.
It's been raised by a number of people with us. Will you do that?
Yes, my understanding is that we have recently begun to notify claimants about decisions, so there's some people who are getting answers from us, but I will report back to you on that.
Thank you. Counterterrorism. How does the department's budget, 2018 budget, particularly funding for the FBI, improve its partnership with, say, with the United Kingdom and other Five Eye partners in the global war on terror? And what benefits do you feel will come from a new bilateral agreement between the U.S. and the U.K. to expand data sharing in this area?
Thank you, Senator. National security is our highest priority, and the key to effectively combating terrorism is to work with our partners in foreign countries. So that is critically important to us. With regard to this issue of the bilateral agreement between the U.S. and the U.K., I think that that is critical to allow us to lawfully and efficiently access electronic data. Data sharing is critical, and of course one of the challenges is we share data, but we also need to maintain the confidentiality of data. What we introduced last month was a legislative proposal to enable bilateral agreements, and those key benefits would include helping our allies investigate and fight serious crime, reducing and eliminating conflicts of laws that put our technology companies in a difficult position. This is a challenge for American companies that have information. It may be lawful in one country, but not in another country to share it. And so this bilateral agreement process will allow us to bring our laws into harmony. And it will also accomplish other goals, such as reducing the incentive to localize data by companies. So we look forward to working with the Congress, and we look forward to addressing any other concerns that you may have about it.
Thank you. In the area of cybersecurity, over the past couple of years, we've all witnessed serious data breaches occur in the U.S. government and also the private sector, including at some of the nation's largest companies and financial institutions. The department is requesting additional funding in the year 2018 budget to combat cybercrime across several agencies, including the FBI, the National Security Division, the Criminal Division, and many U.S. attorneys' offices. The question here is, what is the department proposing to do differently or additionally in 2018 to combat cybercrime that it is currently unable to accomplish with existing funds?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, Senator, cybercrime is an area of emerging challenges, changes in technology, constantly create new challenges for us. Some changes in technology actually are developed in an effort to defeat enforcement efforts. And so our enhancements include $41.5 million to enhance the FBI's cyber efforts. And that will include improving its technological tools and expanding high-speed networks. It includes $20 million to address threats posed by foreign intelligence and insiders, and $22 million to address this going dark problem, which I think is our most significant law enforcement challenge.
But you have a heck of a challenge here, do you not?
Yes, we do, and we have extraordinarily talented agents and prosecutors and support personnel, but this technology, Senator, is a tremendous challenge for us because they're always trying to stay a step ahead of us.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rosenstein, I very much appreciate the statements that you've made here this morning about your commitment to addressing the heroin and opioid epidemic. As you may be aware, in New Hampshire, we are second only to West Virginia in terms of the percentage of overdose deaths we have. And this year, sadly, we have seen carfentanil arrive in New Hampshire and have had 6 people die in the state from carfentanil. And I understand that the department is looking at reprioritizing efforts to address drug enforcement. But I guess I just disagree with you in a couple of areas. One is on eliminating the COPS Anti-Heroin Task Force grant program. Senator Feinstein talked about her efforts to start a focus on meth, which has been successful. It was looking at that successful model that Senator Leahy and I did in trying to direct some support to local law enforcement. And while I think a lot of our DEA agents and our federal law enforcement officials, they do a great job, we just don't have as many of them in New Hampshire as we do local law enforcement. And we need to provide some resources for local law enforcement because they're the people who day in and day out are actually on the front line. So I would urge you to go back and rethink whether eliminating that task force, the Anti-Heroin Task Force grant program, is really in the interest of what we're all trying to accomplish. And I would also ask what you're doing to address you talked about meeting with China to look at what we're seeing in mail order drugs that are coming into the United States. There was a story this weekend by the New York Times reporting on the dark web that is being used to sell synthetic drugs and opioids like fentanyl. Can you tell me what you're doing to shut down those sites?
Yes, Senator. First of all, with regard to the task forces, I completely respect your view on that. The point I'd simply like to make is we have different ways of addressing the same issue, but we are committed to spending more resources on heroin and opioid drugs.
Can I just interrupt you? Because the other issue that has been brought up by several of my colleagues has been the drug courts, which we have found to be very effective in New Hampshire, and yet you've reduced funding for drug courts in the 2018 budget.
I had the number. I'm not certain about the reduction in drug courts.
From $43 million to $40 million.
Okay, right.
And while it's may not seem like a lot of money in New Hampshire, that's a lot of money.
Yep, I understand. Oh, it's a lot of money to me too, Senator, but I think it does reflect nonetheless a commitment. That $40 million does reflect our confidence that that program can be effective, and I'm sure that if that program is funded, I'll work with the Office of Justice Programs. I know I'll work with the Office of Justice Programs to make sure it's spent effectively. To address your question about China, as I said, I've been in this job for 6 weeks. I have not met with China. But I do hope to talk with DEA and with the Postal Inspection Service and any other federal agencies that have a stake in this to figure out what we can do. The problem with the dark web, and I'm familiar with the story you're referring to, is that it's a very effective tool for criminals to commit crime with limited ability to be detected. But we do have ways to catch those criminals. We had a case just a couple of years ago involving a dark website in which the defendant was caught and successfully prosecuted in New York and will no longer be in position to use the Internet as a tool to distribute drugs and to facilitate other crimes. So we do have the ability to catch these offenders, but it is challenging because of the technological burdens. But I will work with FBI, DEA, Secret Service, and other agencies to do everything that we can to get ahead of that problem.
Thank you. And if there are legal changes in policy that need to be made, I hope you will share that with us so we can try and support your efforts. Let me go to another topic very quickly, because in April, the Marshal Service publicly released that they estimate the round-the-clock protective detail for Education Secretary DeVos to be $1 million a month. By the end of September, this is going to total $8 million. I just wonder if you can tell me why the Marshal Service is playing the role in her protective detail. I understand 4 to 8 deputy marshals at a time on the detail, when the Department of Education has their own security team. Can you tell me who made this determination about why this was necessary? And my understanding is the only time that this has ever been done before was for the ONDCP drug czar in the 90s.
Senator, I do not know that decision was made before I was confirmed, but what I'd like to do is look into it and get back to you.
I would appreciate that. I was a governor. I have had credible threats against me. I have never had 4 to 8 people on my detail 24 hours a day. Thank you.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Shelby. Thank you, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein. I appreciate the chance to talk with you about some of the budgetary details relating to the Department of Justice. First, just to follow up on a number of senators who've talked with you about fentanyl and the heroin crisis, I just commend to you the STOP Act, a bipartisan bill led by Senators Portman and Klobuchar. Many of us are co-sponsors, myself included, that tries to deal with some of the issues around the shipment of fentanyl into the United States and strengthen some of our postal inspection abilities. On an appropriations subcommittee where I'm the ranking, we have responsibility for the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It's not the subject of this hearing today, but I do intend to push back on the elimination of funding because I think their HIDTA program has been particularly helpful. The Bulletproof Vest Partnership is a program I've long supported, and it's given roughly 13,000 jurisdictions bulletproof vests that are anatomically appropriate, current best technology, where the federal role is making sure that they are high-performing bulletproof vests, and they have literally saved the lives of law enforcement officials, some of whom I know personally from my home state. I'm pleased the request maintains funding for this important program, but the request makes it a carve-out in the Justice Assistance Grants rather than being funded separately as has been the case in the past. Similarly, the Body-Worn Camera Partnership is a carve-out of the Justice Assistance Grant Program. So effectively, these two programs would cut Justice Assistance grants by $45 million by carving them out rather than having them separately funded, on top of the $71 million cut that's clearly shown in the request. In a budget focused on addressing violent crime and supporting law enforcement, why did the administration slash resources for state and local law enforcement by making the Bulletproof Vest Partnership and the Body-Worn Camera Partnership a carve-out of the larger JAG program rather than funding them separately?
Senator, my understanding is that we have recommended $22.5 million for that Bulletproof Vest program, which I agree with you is important. And as you point out, it actually is consistent with the amount that was allocated in over the last 2 fiscal years. With regard to, my understanding is it's set aside. It is set aside within the Byrne JAG program. So I don't know the technical reasons for that, but I can tell you that I think it's an important program, and the budget does propose to spend $22.5 million on those vests, and if approved, I'm sure we will.
I look forward to working with you to ensure those resources are available in a long-term and predictable way. I just was pointing out that the reduction in Byrne JAG, which I think 50 senators joined a letter opposing a reduction in that, is even greater because these are programs previously separately funded. My hometown of Wilmington is one of a number of cities where we've seen a significant spike in violent crime, and the Violence Reduction Network was an effective, high-impact partnership between federal law enforcement and local law enforcement. Just to give one example, we saw homicide clearance rates jump from below 20% to above 50%. And I want to specifically thank, again, OJP's Bureau of Justice Assistance and their hardworking team for their efforts. It made possible John Skinner, who is a Baltimore PD leader, coming to Wilmington and coordinating a whole series of different federal law enforcement interventions that were cumulatively very powerful. In your response to my questions for the record in your confirmation hearing, you said reducing violent crime would be a top priority for you, and you'd review the funding mechanisms and available resources. Will you commit to ensuring federal resources continue to assist cities like Wilmington who've partnered, who've made progress, who've shown themselves to be good partners with federal law enforcement through programs like VRN in the past?
Yes, Senator. In fact, John Skinner, I knew John from Baltimore, and I worked with the department in the VRN rollout, and I'm very pleased that the program was effective in Wilmington. We're requesting funding of $5 million for the National Crime Reduction Assistance Network, which is the formal name of VRN, or the Violence Reduction Network. And I think that really is a very important opportunity for cities to consult directly with the department and with national and international practitioners and researchers, people who have proven track records and can bring best practices to local jurisdictions, because we have a lot of extraordinarily committed law enforcement officers out there, police chiefs and sheriffs, who welcome the assistance, the insights that can be provided from somebody who comes in and takes a fresh look and brings ideas that may be working in other places. So I strongly support that program. We have a symposium, I believe it may be even next week, a symposium that is part of our violent crime initiative, and I do intend to make that a priority.
Well, thank you. And anything we can do to appropriately partner between federal law enforcement and some of the municipalities in my home state that continue to see sustained elevated stubbornly difficult levels of crime. If anything, they've gotten worse in the past year. We have new leadership in the city and in the city police department. We have dedicated law enforcement officers, and our previous chief was also quite responsive, as the VRN success shows. But we need to continue to engage on this, and I appreciate the investment in learning from and carrying forward what VRN was able to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for appearing here today. And if there are no further questions this afternoon, senators will have an ability to submit additional questions for the record, and which would be part of the hearing record, and we'd request the Department of Justice answer those questions, because some of the senators were in other committees today. This subcommittee stands in recess until Thursday, June the 29th at 10 a.m., when we will take the testimony of Acting NASA Administrator Robert Lightfoot. Committee is adjourned.